For a long time, Brad Pitt didn't feel like just another movie star. He felt like an idea, a symbol of charm, control, success, and effortless confidence. The kind of man Hollywood seemed to build perfectly. The face people recognized before he even spoke. The name that carried power before the story even began. And for years, the public didn't just watch him. They believed in him. They believed in the smile. They believed in the calmness. They believed in the version of Brad Pitt that looked untouchable. Because when an image becomes that powerful, people stop questioning it. They stop looking for cracks. They stop asking what might be hidden behind the silence. And that is where the real story begins. Not when everything fell apart, but long before that, back when almost everyone still thought the image was real. At first, nothing looked different, not on the surface. The headlines still sounded familiar. The same tone, the same language, the same version of him repeated again and again. But something underneath it all had already started to shift, quietly, gradually, in ways that didn't ask for attention. Because real change doesn't always show up in obvious ways. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wait to be noticed. It happens in the background, in the space between what people expect and what is actually happening. And that is exactly where things begin to fall apart. Not in the spotlight, but behind it. Because the public wasn't reacting to who he was becoming. They were reacting to who they believed he still was. And that difference starts small, almost invisible, until one day, it isn't. Until the version people keep repeating no longer matches what they are seeing. And when that happens, the image doesn't collapse right away. It stretches, it bends. It tries to hold itself together until it reaches a point where it can't anymore. Most people believe there was a moment, a specific point in time, something they can point to and say that is when everything changed. That is when the image broke. That is when the truth came out. But that idea is misleading because what feels like a sudden shift is almost never sudden at all. It is recognition, delayed, incomplete, and often too late. Because by the time people think something has changed, they are not witnessing the beginning. They are witnessing the result, the surface, the part that finally becomes impossible to ignore. And in his case, that moment wasn't the cause. It was the exposure, the point where the image could no longer fully cover what had been building underneath. And once that happens, everything starts to feel different, not because reality changed overnight, but because perception is finally catching up to something that has already moved far beyond it. And that realization is where the discomfort begins. There is something deeply uncomfortable about realizing you may have believed in a version of someone that no longer exists, or maybe never fully did. Because the world doesn't just observe people like Brad Pitt, it constructs them carefully, repeatedly, through headlines, interviews, moments, and fragments, until those pieces begin to feel complete, until they feel undeniable. But they are not. They are interpretations, simplified, reinforced, and repeated so often that they slowly replace reality. And that is where the gap begins. The space between who someone actually is and what the world continues to see. And the longer that gap exists, the more stable the illusion feels, because nothing appears to be changing. Everything still looks familiar, still recognizable, still safe, but underneath that surface, the distance keeps growing, quietly, constantly, until something stops aligning. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in subtle ways. A tone that feels different, a presence that doesn't quite match, a reaction that feels slightly out of place. And once you notice that, you can't ignore it, because the image you trusted no longer explains what you are seeing. And that is when the gap becomes visible, not as a clear answer, but as a question, a quiet, persistent doubt that doesn't go away. Most people, when they feel misunderstood, try to fix it. They explain, they clarify, they respond again and again until the narrative feels under control, because that is what the world expects. A statement, a correction, something clear enough to rebuild the image people are losing. But he didn't do that, not in the way people are used to. And that choice is more revealing than any explanation could ever be. Because when someone refuses to fully explain themselves, it removes the structure people depend on, the version they can argue with, the version they can defend, the version they can rebuild. And without that structure, something unusual happens. The responsibility shifts from him to the audience. People are left to interpret, to question, to fill in the gaps on their own. And that process changes the way the image exists, because instead of being controlled, it becomes uncertain, fluid, unstable, and that instability is where perception starts to break down. Not because he corrected it, but because he didn't. Because the real collapse is never loud. It doesn't arrive with a headline. It doesn't announce itself or ask to be seen. It happens quietly, inside perception. In the moment, people stop feeling certain about who someone really is. And once that certainty is gone, it doesn't come back the same way. Because trust in an image is not built on truth. It is built on consistency. And when that consistency breaks, even slightly, everything begins to feel different. Not instantly, not dramatically, but gradually, in ways that are hard to explain and impossible to ignore. Until one day, the version people believed in no longer feels real at all. And that is the collapse no one talks about. Not the event, not the moment, but the quiet shift where belief disappears and certainty never returns. Because in the end, an image doesn't fall when something happens. It falls when people no longer know what to believe.